Okay, so let's get right into it. We're going to talk about the Republic of Nauru. It's the third smallest nation in the entire world, just a tiny speck in the Pacific Ocean. But you know what? Its size is deceptive. This little island is probably the most powerful, most extreme example of something called the natural resource curse. It's a truly wild story about how having everything can lead to absolute ruin. Wow. I mean, this quote from a former minister, it just says it all, doesn't it? That is pure regret. And it sets up the big question we're trying to answer here. How on earth did a country that was once the richest on the planet per person end up like this? What went so catastrophically wrong? And this visual is basically the whole story in a single frame. On the left, you have Pleasant Island. That's what Europeans called Nauru when they first saw it, this lush green paradise. And on the right, well, that's what it became, a barren, scarred moonscape. That contrast, right there, is the heart of this entire tragic tale. So, let's start at the beginning. Section 1, A Paradise Lost. We're going to look at how this all started, and at the origins of the one resource that would decide Nauru's fate. So the treasure here wasn't gold, it wasn't diamonds, it wasn't oil, it was phosphate. And get this, it's basically just ancient, fossilized bird droppings. Yeah. As weird as that sounds, this stuff was like gold dust. Why? Because it's the key ingredient for agricultural fertilizer. And in the 20th century, that was absolutely essential for feeding a booming world population. And the change happened so fast. For centuries, it was just Pleasant Island. Then, bam, early 1900s, the phosphate is discovered. Colonial powers immediately move in to start digging it up. By the time Nauru finally gets its independence in 1968, its entire identity, its entire economy was completely tied to this one single thing. Which brings us to our second section, and this is where the story just gets completely surreal. We're calling it Richer Than America. By 1981, Nauru had the highest GDP per capita in the world. We're talking the equivalent of $88,000 for every single man, woman, and child living on the island. In today's money, that is just a staggering, almost unimaginable amount of wealth. And just to put that into perspective for you, at its absolute peak, the average person on this tiny island was twice as wealthy as the average American. The country was quite literally swimming in cash. But here's where you start to see the first cracks forming. The unemployment rate was 90%. And no, that wasn't a crisis, it was by choice. Why would you work? The government gave everyone free healthcare, free education, and citizens just lived off these huge royalty checks from the phosphate mining. And the money led to these just unbelievable, almost comical stories of excess. Sports cars were the ultimate status symbol, even though you could drive around the entire island in less than an hour. The most famous story is about the police chief who imported a brand new Lamborghini, only to find out he was too big to even fit behind the wheel. That just perfectly captures the absurdity of it all. And that, of course, brings us to Section 3, the curse takes hold. Because hiding just beneath all that money and all those sports cars, a classic economic trap was snapping shut. And things were about to go very, very wrong. Nauru is the textbook example, the poster child, for this concept called the natural resource curse. It's this strange, tragic paradox where having a ton of one valuable resource doesn't lead to long-term success. Actually, it usually leads to the exact opposite. So, how does this curse actually work? Well, a big part of it is something economists call Dutch disease. Basically, the phosphate industry was so profitable, so dominant, that it completely killed off every other part of Nauru's economy. Farming, fishing, you name it, there was just no reason to do anything else. And the consequences went way beyond just economics. They were devastating for the people. First, the mining itself stripped away all the topsoil, making it impossible to grow food. So traditional diets of fish and coconuts got replaced by cheap, imported junk food. This led to one of the worst obesity epidemics in the world, and life expectancy plummeted to just 60 years old. Which leads us straight into Section 4, From Riches to Ruins. This is the part of the story where the phosphate started to run dry, and the government's desperate attempts to save the economy just made everything fall apart even faster. Their attempts to pivot the economy were just a series of absolute disasters. First, they tried to become an offshore banking haven, but they ended up as a hub for money laundering, which got them labeled a rogue state by the US. Then, their national savings fund was completely wiped out by fraud and unbelievably bad investments.
And my personal favorite, they invested millions in a London musical about Leonardo da Vinci that was a legendary, spectacular flop. You can't make this stuff up.
And just look at how quickly this happened. The fall was terrifyingly fast. In 1981, they're the richest people in the world. By the 90s, the money is being lit on fire. And by 2001, just 20 years after hitting the peak, the phosphate is gone, and the country is officially bankrupt. I mean, the economic freefall is almost unbelievable. Their GDP per person collapsed from that incredible high all the way down to about $2,500. That's a drop of over 90%. Just gone. So finally, we get to our last section, the final lesson. What happens to a country after all the money is gone and the land itself is ruined? Well, the reality today is pretty grim. Nauru basically survives as a client state. Its main source of income now comes from hosting these controversial offshore detention centers for Australia. It's a lifeline, sure, but it's a lifeline built entirely on dependency. So if we look at a final scorecard, it's devastating. The environment is described as a barren moonland. The economy is completely reliant on foreign aid, and unemployment is still at that staggering 90%. It is a stark, powerful cautionary tale. And all of this leaves us with one last big question. Nauru had one of the most valuable physical resources in the ground, and it led them to total ruin. So it really forces you to ask, what is the most valuable resource a nation can truly have? Maybe, just maybe, it's not something you can dig up and sell, but something you have to build.